There's a specific kind of silence that most people misunderstand. It's not the silence after an argument. It's not distance created by anger. It's the silence of someone who has already made their decision. And when that silence comes from an empath, it means something has already ended. See, people assume empaths will always stay, always understand, always forgive. They believe that no matter what happens, the empath will find a reason to hold on just a little longer. But what they don't see is the quiet shift happening beneath the surface. Because while you're repeating the same behaviors, ignoring, dismissing, taking, they're observing, feeling, processing everything on a deeper level than you realize. They're not reacting right away. They're not creating drama. They're not walking out in the heat of the moment. They're studying the pattern. And once that pattern becomes clear, once they realize their energy is no longer respected, their presence no longer valued, and their emotions no longer safe, that's when something inside them changes, not loudly, not suddenly, but permanently. Because when an empath decides to leave your life, it doesn't start with a goodbye. It starts with a realization, I deserve better than this. Empaths are often misunderstood because their reactions don't match what most people expect. When they're hurt, they don't always raise their voice, demand attention, or create a dramatic scene. Instead, they go quiet, and that quietness is where the real shift begins. It's easy to assume that silence means acceptance, that if they're not arguing or confronting you, then everything must be fine. But with an empath, silence usually means they've started to pull their energy back. In the beginning, an empath is incredibly patient. They try to understand where you're coming from, even when your behavior doesn't make sense. If something hurts them, they'll often communicate it clearly, not to blame you, but to fix the connection. They want things to work, so they give you the benefit of the doubt. They assume good intentions. They believe that if you just become aware of the issue, things will improve. But when the same boundary gets crossed again and again and again, something starts to wear down. At first, it's subtle. They might repeat themselves, hoping this time it will land differently. They might explain their feelings in a new way, thinking maybe you didn't fully understand before. But each time they have to revisit the same issue, a small piece of their emotional energy gets drained. Not because they're weak, but because they're investing deeply and not seeing that investment respected. What most people don't realize is that empaths keep track of patterns, not just isolated moments. One mistake won't push them away. Even a few mistakes won't. But repeated behavior sends a message. It tells them that what they feel isn't being taken seriously, that their boundaries aren't being honored, and that their effort is becoming one-sided. And when that realization starts to settle in, their approach changes. They stop over-explaining. They stop reminding you of what hurts them. They stop trying to fix everything on their own. This isn't because they suddenly don't care. It's because they've recognized that caring alone isn't enough to sustain a healthy connection. There has to be mutual respect, mutual effort, and mutual awareness. Without that, all their emotional investment turns into exhaustion. So instead of reacting outwardly, they begin withdrawing inwardly. They become more reserved. Conversations become shorter. Their energy feels different, not cold, but distant. They're no longer as quick to engage, as eager to connect, or as willing to overlook things that once bothered them. And this is the stage where many people misinterpret what's happening. They think, oh, things have calmed down. They assume maybe it wasn't a big deal after all. But in reality, the empath has stopped fighting for something they no longer believe will change. That withdrawal is not random. It's protective. It's their way of creating space between themselves and the source of repeated discomfort. Because at some point, they realize that constantly exposing themselves to the same emotional harm is no longer an act of patience. It's an act of self-neglect. And once an empath reaches that awareness, their silence becomes intentional. They're no longer trying to convince you to understand them. They're no longer waiting for you to change. They're no longer investing energy where it isn't being valued. Instead, they're observing from a distance, confirming what they've already started to feel, that the connection is no longer aligned with their emotional well-being. This is why their final decision often feels sudden to others. From the outside, it looks like they just woke up one day and decided to disappear. But from their perspective, it's been building for a long time. Every ignored boundary, every dismissed feeling, every repeated behavior has been quietly stacking up. And by the time they fully withdraw, they've already processed the loss. That's the part people rarely understand. They don't leave in the middle of confusion. They leave after clarity, after they've given chances, after they've communicated, after they've tried to make it work in ways most people never even notice. So when they finally step away, there's no need for a dramatic explanation, no need for one last argument, no need to prove a point, because their silence says everything. It says they've reached their limit. It says they've chosen their peace. And most importantly, it says they're no longer willing to stay in a place where their boundaries are treated like suggestions instead of standards. Disrespect, manipulation, and emotional inconsistency don't always show up in obvious ways. In fact, most of the time, they're subtle, small behaviors that seem insignificant on their own, but become powerful when repeated. And with an empath, it's rarely one major incident that causes disconnection. It's the accumulation of these patterns that slowly changes how they see you. Disrespect doesn't have to look like open hostility. It can show up as interrupting them when they speak, dismissing their concerns, or making them feel like their emotions are too much. It's in the moments where they open up and are met with indifference, sarcasm, or impatience. For an empath, emotional expression isn't casual, it's vulnerable. So when that vulnerability is met with anything less than care, it leaves a mark. At first, they may brush it off. They'll tell themselves, you didn't mean it that way. They'll give you grace, because that's what they naturally do. But repeated disrespect sends a different message over time. It tells them that their inner world isn't being valued, that their voice isn't being taken seriously, and that their presence is being taken for granted. Then there's manipulation, which is often even harder to detect, especially because empaths tend to see the good in people. Manipulation doesn't always come in obvious forms like control or deceit. Sometimes it's emotional, subtle guilt tripping, shifting blame, or making them feel responsible for your reactions. It's when their feelings are turned against them, or when they start questioning their own reality because of how situations are framed. An empath will initially try to understand this too. They'll think, maybe I misunderstood. They'll look inward, wondering if they're overreacting. But over time, something starts to feel off. They notice that conversations leave them drained instead of resolved. They realize they're apologizing more than they should. They begin to see that the emotional balance is skewed, and not in a healthy way. What's dangerous about manipulation is that it slowly erodes trust, not just in the other person, but in themselves. And once an empath starts to feel that internal disconnect, it becomes very difficult for them to stay emotionally invested in the same way. Then comes emotional inconsistency, the unpredictable shifts in behavior that keep them off balance. One day you're attentive, kind, and fully present. The next, you're distant, dismissive, or unavailable. There's no stability, no clear pattern they can rely on. And while some people might tolerate that unpredictability, for an empath, it creates emotional confusion because they don't just respond to actions, they respond to patterns. When those patterns are inconsistent, it forces them into a constant state of adjustment. They start overthinking, trying to figure out what changed, what they did wrong, or how to bring things back to the good version of the connection. They invest more energy trying to stabilize something that isn't steady to begin with. But eventually, that effort becomes exhausting. They realize they're constantly adapting to your moods, your availability, your shifting behavior, while their own needs are being overlooked. And that's when emotional inconsistency stops feeling like a phase and starts feeling like a risk. Because for an empath, emotional safety is everything. They need to know that the connection they're investing in isn't going to fluctuate without reason. They need to feel that what they give is being met with reliability, not unpredictability. And when that foundation is missing, it creates a sense of instability that they can't ignore forever. So what happens next isn't dramatic. It's decisive. They begin to step back, not out of anger, but out of awareness. They stop engaging in the same way. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop chasing clarity from someone who keeps changing the message. And most importantly, they stop giving the same level of access to someone who hasn't handled it with care. This is the turning point. Because once an empath connects the dots between disrespect, manipulation, and inconsistency, their perspective shifts permanently. They no longer see isolated incidents. They see a pattern that threatens their emotional well-being. And when that pattern becomes undeniable, they don't stay to fix it. They leave to protect themselves, not impulsively, not emotionally, but intentionally. Because they understand something most people learn too late. You can't build a healthy connection on unstable behavior, and no matter how much they once cared, no matter how much they once invested, once they recognize that their presence is being mishandled in these ways, walking away stops feeling like a loss and starts feeling like a necessary decision. Empaths are known for how deeply they give, but what's often overlooked is how intentional that giving really is. They don't invest their time, energy, and emotional presence into just anyone. When they choose to care, it's a conscious decision. They listen closely, they support genuinely, and they show up in ways that make other people feel seen and understood. It's not surface-level effort, it's full engagement. But because they give so much, there's an assumption people often make, that this level of care is endless. It's not. An empath's generosity doesn't come from having no limits. It comes from having strong values around connection, empathy, and emotional honesty. And as long as those values are being respected, they will continue to show up fully. They'll be patient through misunderstandings, forgiving through mistakes, and present even when things aren't perfect. But there's a line, and that line is emotional safety. The moment an empath begins to feel unsafe in a connection, everything starts to shift. And emotional safety isn't just about avoiding obvious harm. It's about consistency, trust, and the ability to be open without fear of being dismissed, judged, or manipulated. When that safety is present, an empath thrives. They become even more supportive, more expressive, more connected. But when it's compromised, even in small ways, they notice. Not always immediately, but eventually, it might begin with a feeling they can't quite explain. Something feels off. Conversations don't land the same way. There's a subtle tension where there used to be ease. And because empaths are naturally introspective, their first instinct is to look inward. They ask themselves questions like, am I overthinking this? Did I misunderstand? Maybe I'm being too sensitive. So instead of pulling away right away, they often lean in. They try to communicate more clearly. They try to fix what feels misaligned. They give the other person space to adjust, to understand, to meet them halfway. But if those efforts aren't reciprocated, if the same behaviors continue, if the same discomfort keeps showing up, that internal questioning starts to turn into clarity. They begin to recognize that the issue isn't just a misunderstanding. It's a pattern, and that's when the emotional shift begins. They stop feeling as open as they once did. The same conversations that used to feel natural now feel guarded. They think twice before sharing something personal. They become more selective with their words, not because they want to distance themselves, but because they're trying to protect what's left of their emotional energy. This is the stage where the connection starts to change in a way that's hard to reverse. Because once an empath associates a person with emotional discomfort, It becomes difficult for them to fully relax in that space again. Even if there are good moments, the underlying tension remains. There's a part of them that stays alert, cautious, aware, and over time that awareness turns into detachment. Not all at once, not in a way that's obvious, but steadily. They stop relying on the person the same way. They stop expecting the same level of understanding. They stop investing at the depth they once did. And here's the key point. This isn't punishment. It's adaptation. They're adjusting to what the connection has shown them. They're aligning their energy with the reality they've experienced, not the potential they once believed in. Because empaths don't just want to feel connected. They need to feel safe being connected. And when that safety is gone, staying fully invested becomes impossible. Eventually, they reach a moment of decision. It's not dramatic. It's not fueled by a single argument or a sudden realization. It's the result of everything they've felt, processed, and observed over time. They ask themselves a simple but powerful question. Can I continue being in this connection without compromising myself? If the answer is no, then the next step becomes clear. They begin to disconnect completely. At this point, they're no longer trying to repair what's broken. They've already tried. They've already communicated. They've already given chances. What they're doing now is choosing themselves. And when an empath makes that choice, it's not temporary, because by the time they walk away, they've already let go emotionally. They've already grieved the connection internally. They've already accepted that what they needed wasn't being met. They've already decided that their peace matters more than staying attached. So from the outside, it might look sudden. It might feel confusing. It might seem like they gave up too quickly. But in reality, they stayed longer than they should have. They just stopped showing it. And once they reach that level of clarity, there's no going back to how things were. Not because they don't care, but because they've learned that caring without safety comes at too high a cost. So they move on, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet certainty that they've made the right decision. Because for an empath, walking away isn't about losing someone else. It's about finally refusing to lose themselves. Losing an empath rarely comes from one dramatic moment. It's not usually a single argument, a harsh word, or one obvious mistake that causes them to walk away. If anything, empaths are some of the most forgiving people you'll meet. They can handle misunderstandings. They can work through conflict. They can even tolerate difficult phases in a relationship if they believe there's honesty and effort behind it. What actually creates distance is something much quieter and far more dangerous. It's the repetition of small behaviors that slowly chip away at trust. At first, these behaviors don't seem like a big deal. Maybe it's not responding when they open up about something important. Maybe it's brushing off their feelings with a joke or a change of subject. Maybe it's saying you'll do something and then not following through. On their own, these moments can be explained away. Life gets busy. People make mistakes. Not everything needs to be perfect. And empaths understand that better than most. So they give you room. They don't jump to conclusions. They don't assume the worst. In fact, they often do the opposite. They assume the best. They tell themselves there must be a reason. They give you time to show consistency. They trust that what feels like a small disconnect won't turn into a pattern. But that's where everything hinges. Patterns. Because when those same small behaviors start repeating, they stop feeling accidental and start feeling intentional. Not necessarily in a malicious way, but in a way that signals a lack of awareness or care. And for an empath, that distinction matters. They begin to notice things they didn't want to notice before. How often they're the one initiating conversations. How often they're the one checking in. How often they're the one adjusting, compromising, or understanding, while the other person remains the same. And with each repeated moment, something internal shifts. Trust isn't something that breaks all at once for an empath. It erodes slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And because it happens over time, it's easy for the other person to miss it completely. From the outside, everything might still look normal. The conversations are still happening. The connection still exists. There's no obvious conflict, but underneath, the foundation is changing. The empath starts to feel less secure, less valued, less certain about where they stand, and instead of reacting immediately, they observe. They collect evidence, not in a calculated way, but in a natural emotional way. They feel the imbalance growing. At this stage, they may try to address it. They might bring up how they're feeling, gently at first. They'll choose their words carefully, not to accuse, but to create understanding. They'll give you the opportunity to recognize the pattern and shift it. And if that effort is met with awareness and change, the connection can recover. But if it's met with defensiveness, dismissal, or temporary improvement, followed by the same behavior repeating again, that's when the damage deepens. Because now it's not just about the behavior, it's about what the behavior represents. It represents inconsistency. It represents lack of follow-through. It represents a gap between words and actions. And for an empath, that gap is where trust starts to disappear. They stop relying on what you say and start believing what you consistently do. And if what you consistently do makes them feel unimportant, unheard, or emotionally unsafe, then their perception of the entire connection begins to shift. This is the part most people underestimate. They think it's just small things. They assume it's not serious enough to matter. But for an empath, small things are never just small things because they reveal bigger truths. They reveal priorities. They reveal effort. They reveal how much the connection is actually being valued. And once those truths become clear, it's very hard to ignore them. The empath doesn't explode. They don't suddenly demand change or issue ultimatums. Instead, they start pulling back in ways that are easy to miss if you're not paying attention. They become less expressive, less available, less invested, not out of spite, but out of realization. They begin to understand that what they're experiencing isn't a temporary phase. It's a pattern that's unlikely to change without genuine effort. And at some point, they ask themselves a question that changes everything. Is this enough for me? If the answer is no, then the process of letting go begins. And here's the key truth. By the time an empath decides to leave, they've already gone through the hardest part internally. They've already wrestled with their feelings. They've already questioned their expectations. They've already given more chances than most people would. So when they finally step away, it's not an impulsive decision. It's a conclusion built on repeated experiences, not assumptions. That's why it feels sudden to the other person. Because while they were seeing isolated moments, the empath was seeing a pattern forming. While they thought things were manageable, the empath was quietly reaching their limit. And once that limit is reached, there's no dramatic ending. Just a quiet withdrawal, because for an empath, leaving isn't about reacting to one big moment. It's about finally accepting what a series of small moments has been trying to tell them all along. In the end, an empath doesn't disappear to punish you. They don't leave to prove a point or to make you chase them. That's not how they operate. They leave because something inside them finally became clear. Staying is costing them more than leaving ever will. And once they reach that clarity, there's no argument strong enough, no apology late enough, and no promise convincing enough to bring them back to who they used to be with you. Because the version of them that kept forgiving, version that kept understanding, version that kept giving without limits, that version is gone. What remains is someone who has learned their worth the hard way and refuses to abandon themselves again. So if you ever find yourself wondering why an empath walked away without a fight, understand this. The fight already happened. You just didn't see it. It happened in their thoughts, in their sleepless nights, in the moments they chose to stay when they should have left. And by the time they finally go silent, they're not confused anymore. They're done. And the most powerful thing about that kind of ending is this: they don't look back.